There are certain faces that become fixtures in the fabric of American television. Familiar, comforting presences that greet us week after week with a steadiness that feels like family. Dan Blocker was one of those rare figures. As Eric Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza, he wasn't the romantic lead or the rugged loner. He was something softer, something sturdier. The kind-hearted middle son whose gentle strength anchored the sprawling Cartwright clan, and in many ways, anchored the series itself. When Bonanza debuted in 1959, it offered more than just Western thrills. It presented a vision of family that, for millions of viewers, felt both aspirational and deeply human. Amid the sweeping Nevada landscapes and the action-packed plots, it was Hoss Cartwright, big-hearted, slightly awkward, and fiercely loyal, who often reminded audiences of what really mattered. And behind that role was Dan Blocker, a man whose personal virtues mirrored those of his on-screen persona more closely than most fans ever knew. But while the world came to know him as the lovable, gentle giant of the Ponderosa, Dan's story began far from the sound stages of Hollywood. Raised in the dust and hardship of Depression-era Texas, he worked behind the counter of a small-town grocery store long before he ever stepped in front of a camera. His path to fame was anything but direct. First a football player, then a soldier, a school teacher, and only then, almost by accident, an actor. His time in the spotlight would be relatively brief. In just over a decade, Dan Blocker became a household name, a symbol of decency in an era when television often chased flash over substance. And then, suddenly, he was gone. At the age of 43, he left this world in a way that stunned both his fans and his colleagues. The void he left behind was more than just a casting dilemma. It was a profound personal loss for those who knew and loved him. Yet Dan Blocker's story didn't end with his passing. It lived on through his family, his fellow actors, and even the land he once called home. It's a story not just of a role or a show, but of a man who lived with quiet purpose and left behind a legacy defined not by glamour, but by grace. This is the story of Dan Blocker, the man behind Hoss Cartwright. A life shaped by hardship, lifted by love, and sealed in the hearts of a generation. Long before the cameras rolled and before a single fan ever knew his name, Dan Blocker was simply Bobby Dan Davis Blocker, a child born into the modest, hardscrabble soil of rural Texas. His arrival on December 10, 1928, made headlines for one extraordinary reason. Weighing in at a remarkable 14 pounds, he became the largest baby ever born in Bowie County at the time. It was an entrance into the world that hinted, perhaps playfully, at the larger-than-life figure he would one day become. His early years unfolded during one of the most difficult chapters in American history. The Great Depression had swept across the country, leaving families like the Blockers struggling to find footing in a landscape of scarcity and uncertainty. Dan's parents, Ora Shack Blocker and Mary Arizona Blocker, had once made a living off the land. But when the bottom dropped out of the economy, they were forced to start anew. Shack, a former farmer, scraped together what he could to open a small grocery store in the town of O'Donnell, Texas. The family lived in the back of that store, side by side with their livelihood, and young Dan grew up with the scent of dry goods in the air and the steady rhythm of hard work all around him. It was in that unglamorous setting that Dan first began to understand the value of perseverance. He helped his father run the shop, often carrying groceries for customers, restocking shelves, and offering a hand where everyone was needed. The townspeople soon came to know the boy as something of a gentle giant, his size already becoming a defining feature. Shack would often joke with neighbors that Dan was so large and energetic, he'd gladly pay someone just to put the boy to work elsewhere. Still, there was never a trace of resentment in those words. Only a father's quiet pride and amusement at the son, who was growing faster than life, could keep up with. By the age of 13, Dan was attending the Texas Military Institute, where his imposing frame found a natural home on the football field. As a linebacker, he played with force, but it was the discipline and order of military training that began shaping his natural sense of duty. He wasn't just big. He was respectful, focused, and humble. Traits that would later endear him to millions, but were first cultivated in the classrooms and locker rooms of his boyhood. The scholarship he earned to Sul Ross State University was more than just a ticket to higher education. It was a doorway into a new world. Dan originally planned to major in English and continue his football career, a practical decision for a young man from modest means. Yet even then, there was something restless inside him, something that would soon lead him down a far less predictable path. In those early years, nothing suggested a future in Hollywood. No dreams of fame, no whispers of destiny. Just a boy who hauled groceries, learned discipline, and grew into a young man guided more by values than ambition. It was this grounding, this firm root in the everyday, that would one day make Dan Blocker not only believable as Hoss Cartwright, but beloved. For a time, it seemed as though Dan Blocker's future would be carved on the gridiron rather than the stage. By the time he reached college at Sul Ross State University, he stood an imposing 6'3" and tipped the scales at nearly 300 pounds. He was a natural on the football field, powerful, disciplined, and dependable. Coaches admired his quiet leadership, and fellow students were drawn to his good-natured presence. But fate, as it often does, had other plans for the young Texan. It began with a modest school play. A production of Arsenic and Old Lace needed someone physically strong to help backstage with lifting props and heavy stage dummies. Dan, with his considerable size and cheerful willingness, was asked to lend a hand. But what started as a favor became a turning point. When one of the actors dropped out, Dan was asked to step into the role of Teddy Brewster, the eccentric, bugle-blowing nephew with a flair for theatrics. It wasn't a glamorous part, but it was enough. The laughter from the audience, the electricity of performance, the camaraderie behind the curtain, it all awakened something new in him. Acting, he realized, wasn't just fun. It was fulfilling. Soon, he was spending more time in the theater department than on the football field. He switched his major from English to speech, much to the surprise of friends and family who had long assumed his future was on the gridiron. But for Dan, the choice was not about chasing attention. It was about the quiet satisfaction of discovery. In acting, he found a place where size wasn't a burden, it was a gift. On stage, his towering frame made him unforgettable, but it was his heart and humor that truly resonated with audiences. Around this time, another life-changing encounter took place. He met Dolphia Parker, a fellow student and aspiring theater technician who was working behind the scenes on campus productions. Their first meeting was hardly romantic. Dan had been goofing off in the auditorium, disrupting rehearsals, and Dolphia had been tasked with asking him to leave. But over time, their mutual respect for the craft of theater brought them together. She encouraged his talent, believed in his potential, and quietly became his partner in both art and life. After graduating in 1950 with a bachelor's degree in speech, Dan was offered the chance to play professional football. It was a tempting offer, prestige, security, and a future many would dream of. But Dan declined. Instead, he joined a friend on the summer stock theater circuit, performing in repertory companies in places like Boston, and even landing a small role in a Broadway production of King Lear. These were not glamorous roles, nor were they well paid. But for Dan, they offered something more valuable: the chance to grow, to perform, and to be part of something meaningful. His decision puzzled some, especially in the football circles where he had once been a rising star. But those who knew Dan best saw the quiet joy he found in theater. He didn't chase fame, he chased fulfillment. And as he took his first humble steps toward a future in performance, he carried with him the groundedness of Texas, the discipline of sport, and a growing love for the stage that would one day make him unforgettable. Just as his theatrical ambitions began to take shape, the world once again called Dan Blocker in another direction. In 1950, like so many young men of his generation, he received a draft notice from the United States Army. The Korean War had escalated, and Dan's rising career was put on hold as duty beckoned. Without hesitation, he answered the call. His time in the military would become one of the most formative chapters of his life. Stationed first at Camp Polk in Louisiana, Dan later joined the 179th Infantry Regiment and was deployed to Japan before seeing combat in Korea. The conditions were unforgiving: freezing winters, sleepless nights, and the ever-present threat of danger. On Christmas Eve of 1951, Dan and his squad endured a 10-hour siege on Hill 255, surrounded by enemy forces. It was a night etched forever into his memory, a test not only of strength, but of endurance and resolve. Despite the hardship, Dan served with distinction. He rose to the rank of sergeant and was awarded several commendations, including the Purple Heart. But what left the deepest mark was not the medals or the title. It was the sense of responsibility, the quiet understanding that life was fragile, and that courage was not loud, but steady. Just 2 days after his honorable discharge in September 1952, Dan married the woman who had quietly stood by him through it all. He and Dolphia Parker wed in an intimate ceremony in Carlsbad, New Mexico. There was no fanfare, only the quiet commitment of two people who believed in each other. Their bond, formed in college theaters and strengthened by letters exchanged during wartime, became the bedrock of a life that would weather many changes. With the war behind him, Dan returned to Sul Ross State University, this time to pursue a master's degree in dramatic arts. Though money was tight, he never wavered. He took jobs wherever he could, teaching English and drama at a high school in Sonora, Texas, and later instructing sixth-grade students in Carlsbad. By day, he taught with warmth and enthusiasm, and by night, he studied, prepared lesson plans, and held his growing family close. Over the next several years, Dan and Dolphia welcomed 4 children, twin daughters, Deborah Lee and Dana Lynn, followed by sons Dirk and David. Fatherhood brought a new sense of purpose. Dan reveled in it. He was a doting husband, a gentle but firm father, and a man committed to building a steady life for those he loved most. The paycheck of a schoolteacher was modest, but his love was abundant. And yet, something still stirred beneath the surface. A yearning not for fame, but for the creative spark he had first discovered on the stage. As the Blocker family relocated to California, Dan enrolled at UCLA with dreams of earning a doctorate. He still envisioned a future in education, possibly as a college professor. But the lure of performance, the joy of becoming someone else for a few brief moments, never quite let go. It would take one more twist of fate to lead him away from the classroom and toward the screen. But even as Hollywood approached, Dan Blocker remained the same. Grounded, principled, and filled with a quiet ambition shaped more by love than by ego. California was never Dan Blocker's intended destination for stardom. He arrived with his young family, not to chase fame, but to pursue a doctorate in dramatic arts at UCLA. The plan was simple: teach, study, and continue providing for Dolphia and their 4 children. His days were filled with textbooks and lesson plans, his evenings spent helping with homework or rocking a baby to sleep. But quietly, between classes and carpools, he began to audition. At first, the roles were small, bit parts in popular television westerns that dominated the airwaves in the 1950s. Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, Maverick, and Have Gun Will Travel all welcomed the towering Texan onto their sets. With each appearance, he brought more than just size. There was a sincerity in his eyes, a gentle cadence to his voice that made him stand out. Viewers remembered him not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself with an authenticity that could not be faked. In 1958, he landed a recurring role in Cimarron City, a short-lived Western series. Though it lasted only 1 season, it gave Dan valuable experience and deepened his love for television acting. Each role was a small step, a quiet progression towards something greater. He was never one to boast or complain. He simply worked, grateful for each opportunity, each new line of dialogue, each early morning call. And then came the turning point. When producer David Dortort began casting for a new series called Bonanza, he was searching for something different. He wanted the show to feel like a family saga, a Western not just about gunfights and cattle drives, but about the bonds between fathers and sons. For the role of Hoss Cartwright, Dortort needed someone special. Someone who could embody strength and sweetness, who could be both protector and comic relief. Dan Blocker, with his soft-spoken Texas charm and gentle physicality, fit the part perfectly. Hoss was never meant to be the star of the show, but Dan made him unforgettable. As the middle son of Ben Cartwright, Hoss wasn't the romantic figure his younger brother Little Joe was, nor the intellectual presence of older brother Adam. But he was the heart of the Ponderosa, awkward and tender, quick to laugh and quicker still to defend what was right. Hoss brought warmth to the screen in a way that was rare and deeply needed. The show began modestly in 1959, but soon grew into one of television's most beloved westerns, airing for an astonishing 14 seasons. Dan quickly found himself recognized wherever he went, his quiet life transformed by fan letters, autograph requests, and public appearances. But he handled it all with grace. He remained devoted to his wife, present for his children, and grounded in the values that had shaped him in Texas. Though Bonanza demanded long hours and intense filming schedules, Dan never lost sight of why he had started acting in the first place. It wasn't to be a celebrity. It was to connect, to tell stories, to bring joy, and to make a living with dignity. Even as his face became known across the country, the man behind Hoss Cartwright stayed remarkably unchanged. He was still the same boy from Bowie County who once hauled groceries, still the soldier who'd endured the snows of Korea, still the father who read bedtime stories with a smile. Hollywood may have discovered Dan Blocker, but it never changed him. As Bonanza climbed the television ratings and Dan Blocker became a household name, fame settled around him not like a crown, but like an overcoat worn lightly with practicality and a certain discomfort. He appreciated the recognition, of course, but never reveled in it. To Dan, being a television star was just an unusual job that allowed him to care for his family. That was the role he cherished most. At home in Northridge, California, Dan lived far from the glitter of Hollywood. The Blocker residence was a modest 4-bedroom home, just 20 miles from the Paramount lot. It had a pool in the backyard and a cozy living room where children's toys were scattered and laughter echoed through the halls. There was nothing extravagant about their lifestyle. Dolphia drove a sensible Cadillac. Dan favored a sleek Corvette Stingray, not for show, but simply because he liked how it felt on the open road. Despite the growing crowds that gathered wherever he went, Dan tried earnestly to shield his children from the glare of celebrity. He wanted them to feel normal, to ride bikes and go to school without the weight of their father's fame trailing behind them. But it wasn't always easy. A simple trip for ice cream could become a scene. Fans would approach, eager to shake his hand or embrace the man they knew as Hoss. Dan handled it with grace, but in quieter moments, he admitted it wore on him. A man never appreciates his privacy until he's lost it, he once confided. And it bugs me. It really bugs me. Still, he remained a fixture in his children's lives. Deborah Lee, Dana Lynn, Dirk, and David grew up knowing not just a television actor, but a father who knelt to tie shoelaces, told bedtime stories in booming voices, and built race car tracks that took over the living room floor. He loved to playfully wrestle, using his towering frame to delight and amuse rather than intimidate. He had a laugh that could fill a room, and a patience that softened even the most stubborn tantrum. In many ways, Dan's home life mirrored the character he portrayed. Like Hoss, he was deeply principled, loyal, honest, and nurturing. But unlike the character, Dan was not naive. He understood the demands of the industry and the fleeting nature of television fame. That's why he held tightly to his family. They were his anchor in a world that could easily become untethered. He found joy not in premieres or press events, but in helping with homework, fixing leaky faucets, and watching his children grow. As they aged, he supported them without pressure, encouraging each of them to find their own path. His son Dirk would later recall how spending time with his father on set gave him an early love for acting, not because it looked glamorous, but because he saw how much his father truly enjoyed the work. Dan also remained in touch with his roots. He frequently visited old friends from his teaching days, kept in contact with his Texas relatives, and never missed an opportunity to return home. He brought his parents to California so they could be close by, treating them with the same steady kindness he showed to everyone in his life. For all his fame, Dan Blocker never lost his sense of who he was. He belonged more to the everyday than to the spotlight. And in the quiet corners of his home, surrounded by the laughter of children and the love of a steadfast wife, he lived a life of extraordinary simplicity, one built not on celebrity, but on character. By the early 1970s, Dan Blocker had become a fixture not only in American households, but in the hearts of television viewers around the world. Bonanza was well into its 12th season, and while ratings had begun to shift with time, Dan's portrayal of Hoss Cartwright remained a beloved constant. Off-screen, he was still the gentle patriarch of his own family, and professionally, he stood at the height of success. Yet, in the spring of 1972, a sudden and tragic event would bring his remarkable journey to an end and shake the entertainment industry in a way few could have foreseen. It began, as such things often do, with something seemingly routine. Dan had long suffered from gallstones, and after enduring ongoing discomfort, he decided to undergo gallbladder removal surgery. It was a common procedure, performed regularly with few complications. Friends and family expected him to recover quickly and return to work in time for the next season of Bonanza. But within days of the operation, something went terribly wrong. While recovering in the hospital, Dan developed a pulmonary embolism, a sudden and fatal blockage in the lungs. There was no warning, no time to prepare. He was gone in an instant. Just like that, the gentle giant of the Ponderosa, the man who had brought so much warmth to so many lives, passed away at the age of 43. News of his untimely passing sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. His co-stars were devastated. Lauren Green, who played Ben Cartwright, struggled to accept the loss of the man he had come to see as a second son. Michael Landon was heartbroken. Cast and crew alike wept openly upon hearing the news. This wasn't just the loss of a colleague. It was the loss of a brother, a friend, a constant. Dan was laid to rest in his hometown of DeKalb, Texas, in the quiet Woodman Cemetery, beside his parents and sister. The funeral was private, attended by family and close friends who gathered to honor a life defined not by spectacle, but by sincerity. The man who had once run groceries through his father's store now rested beneath the same Texas sky he had grown up beneath. His absence left a hollow space that could not be filled. For Bonanza, Dan's death marked an abrupt and devastating turning point. The series had never faced such a loss. In those days, television shows seldom addressed the real-life passing of a main character. Writers were left scrambling. The show was already preparing its next season, and Dan's scenes had been planned, his presence expected. But now, there was no script that could hold the weight of this grief. The ripple effect extended beyond the studio. Fans across the country mourned. Letters poured in from those who had watched Dan every Sunday night, many of whom felt as though they had lost a member of their own family. Children who had grown up watching Hoss's quiet heroism, adults who admired his integrity, strangers who never met him but felt they knew him, all sent their condolences, trying in words to express what his presence had meant. In the months that followed, a quiet reverence settled over the Bonanza set. The familiar halls of the Ponderosa, once filled with easy laughter, now carried an ache. The show would go on, but something essential was gone. Not just a character, but the soul that had made the series feel so deeply human. Dan Blocker's passing was more than a loss for Bonanza. It was a moment that reminded an entire industry of the fragility behind the fame, the man behind the role, and the quiet power of a life well lived. The sudden passing of Dan Blocker cast a long shadow over Bonanza, one that reached far beyond the scripts or the screen. For 13 seasons, audiences had come to view the Cartwright family as something real, a blend of rugged adventure and tender kinship played out every week against the backdrop of the American West. But with the loss of Hoss Cartwright, the heart of the Ponderosa seemed to falter. Behind the scenes, the cast and crew were reeling from a grief that no television storyline could truly capture. Michael Landon, who not only played Little Joe but also served as a writer and director on the show, faced the difficult task of rewriting the upcoming season's opening episodes. Originally, he had crafted a story that centered around Hoss, a tale of brotherhood, love, and growth. But with Dan gone, those plans had to be abandoned. In their place came something far more personal, a quiet farewell masked within a new storyline, one that would mirror the real loss they all felt without ever saying the words aloud. The two-part season opener, titled Forever, aired in September 1972. It followed Little Joe as he fell in love with a woman named Alice Harper. Their romance bloomed quickly, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. They married, and Alice became pregnant. But just as hope took root, tragedy struck. Alice and her brother were attacked in a brutal act of revenge, and their home was burned to the ground. Joe returned only to find ruins of his home, his future, his family. To viewers, it was one of the most emotionally devastating episodes in the show's history. But to those who knew, it was more than fiction. The sorrow on screen was real. The tears shed by Michael Landon and Lorne Greene were not merely scripted. They were an expression of genuine mourning. When Ben Cartwright looked at a photograph of Hoss and fell silent, it wasn't just a character grieving a son. It was Lorne Greene, struggling with the absence of his dear friend. In one particularly poignant scene, Little Joe brings Alice to a secluded spot in the woods and tells her it used to be his and Hoss's happy place. When she remarks on how much he must have loved his brother, Joe says nothing. His silence says everything. It was a moment of aching honesty, grief expressed not in dialogue but in presence. Although the episode never explicitly stated that Hoss had died, his absence loomed over every frame. That choice was intentional. Landon later explained that they believed Dan would have wanted it that way. Understated, respectful without spectacle. The loss of Hoss Cartwright was acknowledged in the only way that truly made sense, by showing what it felt like to carry on without him. In years to come, the 1988 television movie Bonanza, the next generation would finally provide an official explanation for Hoss's absence. He was said to have drowned while trying to save someone else, a noble end, fitting for a character defined by selflessness and courage. It was a fictional echo of the real man, whose life had been marked by quiet bravery and gentle strength. Though Bonanza continued for one final season, the spark had dimmed. Ratings declined. Viewers missed the warmth, the laughter, the steady moral compass that Dan Blocker had brought to the screen. And for those who worked alongside him, the set itself felt changed, less like home, more like a memory. Still, in that last year, they pressed on. Each scene filmed without Hoss was a tribute to what had been, and a reluctant step into what would follow. In the echoes of their grief, there was love. In their performances, there was remembrance. And in the silence left behind, there was the unmistakable presence of a man who had shaped not just a character, but an entire era of storytelling. Dan Blocker's life, though cut short, did not end with his passing. In many ways, it only deepened, taking root not in the spotlight, but in the quiet spaces he left behind. His family, his hometown, the friends who remembered him, and the places that still bear his name. His legacy was not one of loud accolades or grand monuments, but of steady devotion and enduring kindness that continues to echo through time. At home, the values he embodied were passed on through his children. Dirk and David, in particular, carried his legacy into the world of entertainment. Dirk became an actor in his own right, appearing in numerous television roles throughout the 1980s and beyond, eventually gaining recognition as Detective Hitchcock on the long-running NBC comedy Brooklyn Nine-Nine. David took a path behind the camera, building a respected career as a producer. In 1998, he won an Emmy Award for Don King. Only in America, a moment of quiet triumph that would surely have made his father proud. Though both sons found success in Hollywood, they never lost sight of where they came from. Dan had taught them, not through lectures but through example, that fame was fleeting, but character endured. In interviews, Dirk often spoke of his father with reverence, remembering the days he spent watching him work on set, the way he made others laugh between takes, and the seriousness with which he approached his craft. Those memories became more than personal, they became guiding lights. In 2021, Dirk shared a simple, heartfelt tribute on social media. A photograph of his father, accompanied by a reflection on how rarely a day passed without thinking of him. He encouraged others to cherish their own parents while they could. A gentle reminder that the most profound legacies often begin at home. Beyond his family, Dan's name lives on in more public spaces as well. In the upscale Hancock Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, a 5,000 square foot mansion once owned by Blocker still stands. Decades after his passing, it became the home of musician and filmmaker Rob Zombie, a small, strange twist of fate that kept the house in creative hands. In Englewood, California, another of Dan's properties remains, a testament to the stability he built through his work. But perhaps the most poignant tribute lies along the sunlit shores of Malibu. Dan Blocker Beach, a stretch of coastline named in his honor, offers a place of peace and reflection. The land had once been co-owned by his friends and Bonanza co-stars, Michael Landon and Lauren Green. In 1979, 7 years after Dan's passing, they chose to donate it to the state of California in his memory. Later, the land was transferred to Los Angeles County, where it remains a recognized public landmark, a place where visitors can walk, breathe, and remember a man who always preferred the quiet dignity of nature to the noise of fame. It is rare in Hollywood for a man's legacy to remain so intact, so undistorted by time. Dan Blocker achieved that not through ambition or calculation, but through a life rooted in goodness. He did not seek to be remembered, and perhaps that's why he is. Not as a celebrity, but as a father, a husband, a friend, and above all, a man who brought something true into every room he entered. In the end, Dan Blocker's story was not one of spectacle or scandal, but of steady light, of a life lived with intention, humility, and heart. He was never the kind of actor who sought the spotlight for its own sake. Fame was never his pursuit. What he loved was the craft, the people, and the purpose that quietly carried him from the cotton fields of Texas to the sets of Hollywood. As Hoss Cartwright, he became the soul of Bonanza, a role that resonated so deeply with audiences because it asked for something rare in television, sincerity. And Dan gave it week after week, with every glance, every pause, every heartfelt line delivered from beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He brought to the screen a kind of man who was strong not because he wielded force, but because he carried gentleness in a world that didn't often reward it. But his true legacy lies beyond the Ponderosa. It lies in the classrooms where he once taught young minds to read and think. In the quiet support he gave his wife, Dolphia, through decades of marriage. In the laughter of his children and grandchildren. In the beach that bears his name, where the tide moves steadily over sand once walked by a man who never needed to shout to be heard. Dan Blocker was not a typical Hollywood figure. He never chased awards, nor did he build an empire on ambition. And yet, what he left behind is more lasting than most. A legacy built on kindness, presence, and quiet strength. His was the kind of heroism that didn't need applause. In the years since his passing, reruns of Bonanza still flicker on television screens. New generations discover Hoss Cartwright and feel, somehow, that they've met someone genuine. That feeling, that warmth, is Dan Blocker's enduring gift. He passed through this world but once, and in doing so, reminded us all that the most extraordinary lives are often the most grounded. He showed us that the measure of a man is not in how loudly he speaks, but in how deeply he is remembered. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's golden era.